Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is going to be our presentation on the developmental effects of father absence on young minds. And so before we dive into that, I just wanted to say thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here presenting at the ACE conference. It really is an honor to be involved. There's been wonderful teachers before us. So we're talking about the developmental effects of father absence on our students and on children in general. And before we dive into the data and everything, we want to give a little background. So just to explain the structure and how we're going to proceed through this, we'll start with the background, work our way through the data, talk about some of the results that we found in that data, and then the key takeaways and what we really want the audience to take from this and implement in their own classrooms and schools. So let's start with a little introduction. There are some key terms that we think are important to have a common definition of because they can mean different things in different contexts. So we're making sure that we're on the same page with, we came up with these 4 key terms. So the first one that I want to make sure we're on the same page with is family structure. And so what this means is the environment which the child grows up in on a day-to-day basis. Traditionally, this is thought of as a nuclear family, one mother, one father, and raising the children together. But this can vary to just a single parent family or all the way to an extended family structure. And what that would look like would be the child living with some extended family member, grandparent, aunt, uncle, that type of thing. So again, family structure, the environment that the child grows up in on a day-to-day basis. The second thing that we wanted to hit on here was socioeconomic status. This can be defined a few different ways. And in the context of this presentation, socioeconomic status is going to mean the social standing or the class of an individual or group. So it's often measured as a combination of education, income, and occupation. So we're taking a look at not just someone's income, but also their education, what they're doing for work, which is a little bit of a broader definition. The third key term that we want to make sure we have a definition for is extracurricular activities, which will come up again in our key takeaways. And an extracurricular activity, we defined it as an activity performed by students that falls outside of the realm of normal curriculum or school education. So this could manifest itself in a few different ways. Some social activities, philanthropic activities, sports, many of the typical things that you view as extracurriculars. And then the fourth key term here, and this is maybe the most important of the 4, is father absence. And so we're defining that as a child living without a biological step or adopted father in the home. So no biological step or adopted father. And then there are 2 other terms that we want to make sure we define and distinguish between, and that is academic achievement and academic outcomes in the literature. Usually in just common conversation, these are thought of very similarly, but we're distinguishing between them. Academic achievement, we think of as the student performance on test scores and grades achieved. So that's more specifically their scores and the numbers that correlate to how we think of them doing academically, whereas academic outcomes take a more holistic approach, likelihood of graduation, college attendance rates, probability of completing college, social and emotional well-being. And so in this, we're going to focus a little more on academic outcomes instead of academic achievement. And so along these lines, keeping all of this in the back of our minds, what this comes back to is that parents from different socioeconomic statuses can have different parenting approaches. And so that manifests itself particularly when there is a father absence. But before we dive into that, we're just going to talk about how they differ along socioeconomic lines. And so this is according to a Pew Research Center study from 2020. And there are 3 important ways that we found parenting differs along socioeconomic status. The first is with what the family is concerned with. And so parents with different SES have different concerns for their children. Usually in the lower SES, they're more concerned with their physical well-being. So they don't have the time or ability to focus on the mental and emotional well-being of their children as much. Second thing that's different is the after-school activities. Parents of lower SES feel significant barriers to getting into extracurricular activities. And we're going to dive into that a little more later in the presentation. And the third big thing that's different is the academic environment. Parents of lower SES often report that they feel, self-report, that they feel they're not putting enough pressure on their children in school. And so these three things kind of come together to create a different environment for these children. So now we're going to turn it over and talk about the actual effects and some of the empirical data on father absence.
I'm going to follow up after Ryan here, and I'm going to be presenting on the effects of father absence in the literature that we've researched here. And so we're going to take a look at a couple papers from the past decade here. McClanahan 2013, that's a pretty exhaustive meta-analysis of the causal effects of father absence. And I'll go more into those findings later, as well as for Markovitz. This is a 2016 paper analyzing father absence and adolescent depression and delinquency using a comparison of siblings approach. So starting with McClanahan, this is a meta-analysis of father absence studies. Academic achievement, there's no real significant impact there. Academic outcomes and mental health, there is a significant impact. So again, achievement, that is just grades in the classroom, whereas outcomes and mental health, that refers to not just adult mental health and socio-emotional problems, and specifically like substance abuse. As you approach adolescence, you're more likely to enter into these risky behaviors. Again, academic outcomes, that refers to the likelihood of graduating high school. Still longitudinal studies well beyond childhood. There's no significant impact on labor force outcomes or family outcomes for these children as they enter adulthood. And so the discussion for McClanahan, a little bit more in depth here, found that father absence was more, or that the socio-emotional behavior problems were more pronounced if father absence happened early in childhood. That was more pronounced for boys over girls, and also found this risky behavior in adolescents. Again, this is smoking, early childbearing, and failure to graduate high school via problem behaviors. These risky behaviors are at the core of the behaviors that we see over the course of many of these studies here, if the father is in fact absent. Right? And again, there's really no cognitive deficit observed. Beyond late adolescence, there's really minimal evidence of father absence having a significant effect. Again, that's in the labor force as well as in the home. Again, Markovitz, this is a 2016 study. This is a rigorous within families comparison examining father absence and adolescent delinquency. And this is looking for causality here. So it's comparing siblings side by side. And it assessed delinquency and depression on 3-point scales. So depression, those are depressive symptoms and frequency, and delinquency, that's physical fighting, skipping school, and shoplifting. So delinquency, these are certainly behaviors that are accessible to children as they enter adolescence. And the findings here is that father absence later in childhood has a causal effect on adolescent delinquent behavior, but not necessarily depressive behaviors. And so the effects were not as significant for those who experienced father absence from early childhood. And again, minimal evidence of long-run impact beyond adolescence. So that does draw back to McClanahan, but a little bit of a different story here as far as the timing of father absence. The effects were not as significant in Markovitz for those who experienced father absence from early childhood. So in essence, Markovitz sees it more that these children had acclimated to life without a father, if that absence happened early in childhood, whereas if it happened between the ages of 6 and 13, it would be much more of a traumatic effect that would lead to these delinquent behaviors. But again, there's no real correlation with depressive behaviors. And again, there's minimal evidence of a long-run impact beyond adolescence. So I'm going to pass this over to Sean. He's going to follow up with just a little bit more of our research here as we move towards finding some takeaways.
All right, the next article that we look at is the Bernardi and Rattle article from 2014. It is the long-term consequences of parental divorce for children's educational attainment. And the focus there was really on both the short-term but also the long-term impacts that are typically negative consequences of a parental divorce on a child's educational achievement and attainment. And so some of the big ideas within the article are that some of the short-term impacts can be seen immediately, but some of the long-term impacts aren't seen until later in life when they look at the socioeconomic outcomes of that individual. And also what it doesn't touch on too much, but they did mention, is that it is important to recognize that the impact of divorce on educational attainments are important to understand, as a poor educational experience is leading specifically to a couple other factors later in life, being money, so what their socioeconomic status potential outcome is, and also the health of someone, if they're living in poverty or if they're living in a lower socioeconomic status, that can lead to health problems as well due to access to healthcare and access to food. And so these long-term consequences of educational attainment do not just impact a person's academic ability, but by not achieving a higher academic status, it is often more difficult to maintain other areas of your life as well. And then one of the more interesting pieces of the article found that the breakup penalty, so that is the penalty, the percentage points from people with intact families to divorced families for highly educated parents, was the greatest. And we can see that in this chart here. So figure 1 focuses on the predicted probability of tertiary education being post-secondary education attainment by parental divorce and parental education. And so on the x-axis, we can see the levels of education of the parents, so primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and university, and then the distinction between intact and breakup. And while there is a difference between each of the educational levels, that higher levels we just mentioned on the university levels, where we see the largest gap for children's educational attainment between parents who are intact versus parents who have broken up. Finally, some of the outcomes. Parental breakups are associated with negative long-term consequences for children's educational attainment. Parental breakups can impact this role of father being consistently available in a child's life. So if parents are divorced, more often than not, that relationship means the child is going to be spending more time with the mother. However, there are times when the father is the one that is more present in the child's life, but without that father in the life, it can impact the idea of the child's educational attainment. The other article that we looked at was the Zirkle article from 2002, and that was, "Is there a place for me? Role models and academic identity among white students and students of color." And so this article really helps distinguish what a role model is, how they can impact a child's achievement, and how that breaks down on the basis of race, specifically white students and students of color. And so some of the big takeaways from this article are that the article focuses on the emphasis of how students become interested in academic pursuits. And so that ties into what that goal-making process will look like. This often is attributed to the fact that young people only pursue those ideas of that which they can imagine as possible, meaning that if a child can imagine themselves being a teacher one day, they're more likely to be able to understand what goals are needed to become a teacher. Same thing, so if a child could see themselves becoming an investment banker one day, they're more likely to reach goals that push that way. However, if they don't see role models, and by role models in this article, we looked at people who have similar interests, people who match the race and gender matched profile, those people, the representation helps identify what that looks like for a child and helps shape their ideas. And this doesn't just have to do with education. This can also go to athletics and music, as well as other ideas of what academic pursuits can help with. And then with the data, we can see that white students compared to students of color are more likely to both have, one, a role model, and two, have a role model that matches their race and gender identity, where students of color are less likely to find a role model in the first place, but then they're also less likely to find a role model who matches their gender and race identity. And so some of the major impacts of that can lead to that students of color do not feel connected to people in potential role model places, depending on different fields. Students with race and gender match identities show consistently more interest in achievement-related activities and goals, and that relates directly back to the classroom. And then specifically, father figures are often viewed as a role model. And so when father figures are not available because of a divorce or because of a different situation, that can lead to a major lack of goal achieving and academic success for students as they go through their younger years. When they cannot see someone who looks like themselves in a higher role, they are less likely to build those goals towards that role. And we will move on to the key takeaways from there.
So while a lot of this literature and research has great implications for just the developmental psychology and understanding of how adolescents deal with father absence, for our takeaways portion of this conference, we really want to focus on the areas in which we can implement this research into our roles as teachers and educators in the classroom. So our first main takeaway that we really want to look at is kind of a focus on holistic learning. And so while our research showed that a lack of a role model created by father absence does bear heavy implications for a child's behavioral, social, and emotional development, it does have little impact on cognitive growth. And so since we are filling in this role in some capacities as educators, we feel that we can best bridge the gap created by a lack of a father figure by devoting resources to students' academic outcomes rather than the academic achievement. Again, the outcomes are more associated, correlated with the behavioral, social, and emotional elements of education. And so one way we can really do this, kind of a more practical strategy for focusing on the holistic development of our students, is by devoting time in class to practices and techniques aimed towards social emotional learning, or SEL. And there's lots of different ways that we can do this, in things like gratitude studies, and there's a lot of other great practices. But one that we really found to be effective in our research was goal setting and then fidelity to pursuing these goals. So setting a goal and really sticking to it. And so this is shown to boost social and emotional development in students, according to a study by Gannon and a few other researchers. And so by incorporating this in the classroom, we can kind of fill the gap created by father absence and kind of promote behavioral, social, emotional development in our students that are struggling with father absence. And additionally, another kind of connection to this, the goal setting is high school graduation. We thought that'd be a pretty good common goal to kind of use as a template for this practice, since graduation rates are significantly affected by a lack of a father figure. And so we can really push students to stay committed to this academic outcome again, as well as college enrollment with these practices.
All right, so the second takeaway for this topic that we can, again, look to implement in our own classroom is going to be directed at a statistic that Brian actually mentioned earlier. We've got the actual data here from the Pew Research about how higher income parents are more likely to have their kids enrolled in after school activities. This could be anything ranging from sports, clubs, drama, anything like that. And we find that as the lower income parents do not get as many opportunities to send their students to extracurricular activities. So what we can do is we can work to make that a more accessible option for our students and for parents. So it's something as little as maybe sending out an interest survey for our students, seeing what they might want to do and when time works best for them. Just in practice, it seems like it usually works best when it's immediately after school, so parents aren't going back and forth all the time. But really just putting the initiative on ourselves to make it convenient for our students and families, because those sort of practices and extra buy-in activities that they're going to have more a positive effect in the classroom, and it will also help you develop your relationship with those students in a different light, just other than just a teacher-student relationship.
Awesome. And then our third and final takeaway is to bring in other role models. So many of our students' needs, especially in the social emotional realm, can be filled by our presence as teachers in terms of acting as a role model for them, but we can't do the whole picture for them. And so a way to kind of help expedite this process is to bring in other members of the community, other father figures to enter into these students' lives. And this is especially important since a lot of our students will enter careers other than education, and particularly for our ACE students, it is important for them to see representations of themselves in terms of gender and racial identities. And since us going into these schools, we don't always match those racial ethnic identities of our students, it's going to be important for us to bring that in for them. And so this is shown, Parental Circle, to improve multiple developmental areas from access to a role model that does match the race and gender identities. So that's kind of the thinking behind this takeaway. And so kind of our practical step for implementing takeaway 3. One idea we had would just be implementing a career day at our schools. So this could be inviting various local figures, kind of members of the community around our school to come in and talk about what they do in the community and kind of give a window into their lives to the students. And so we believe this would introduce students to positive role models in the community. And of course, to match the Circle study, we would want to find guests who do match their gender and racial identities, just kind of to get the best possible results from this event. And also just kind of to make the effects more long lasting. And so it's not just people coming in, showing up and leaving forever. We would like to provide some means of communication for certain guests so that students can foster kind of more impactful relationships and really kind of create an enduring role model relationship with the guests that come in, if they so desire.
Cool. So as we look back at all we talked about and discussed, while father absence is shown to negatively affect academic outcomes, it's more so going to be impactful in affecting the social emotional developments, not so much their ability to perform certain levels on tests, but more so their behavioral aspects.
Yeah, and then another key takeaway, or conclusion rather, from our whole study is that the greatest time period in which humans are affected by father absence is during adolescence. So these are the years that we will see them in our classrooms during middle and high school. So our roles are really exponentially raised in importance during this time.
And lastly, we mentioned before, but we are not there to be the end all be all answer to it, but we can do a lot in our own power to help our students maybe with different parental structures and father absences. And so even though that we won't be able to fill that role entirely, there are a lot of actionable steps that we can take to make our students' lives better.